A philosopher once said, "For the truly wise, every rock, every tree, every blade of grass contains a lifetime's instruction." It's interesting the places where one learns things. As we all well know, while we tend to associate learning with the school or the classroom, in reality, virtually everything has the potential to teach us something. Life is filled with lessons. We learn from our parents. We learn from our children. We learn from our friends. We learn from our enemies. We learn from observation. We learn from experience. We learn from success and failure, from good times and bad times. Mark Twain once said, "Never let formal education get in the way of your learning." Life, all of life, is potentially a continual classroom with instructors all around us. And quite often, some of the most unlikely things are our greatest teachers. We need only look. And this is something of what our scripture reading this morning is all about. Today we conclude our overview of the book of Proverbs with a text that takes a slightly different slant on things than we've taken over the past weeks in this series, in which the texts have always focused, say, on some specific issue. Instead, in our reading this morning, the author simply instructs us to go and look at something, specifically to look at an ant. "Go to the ant, you lazy bones, consider its ways and be wise." Now, obviously, the primary focus here is, of course, the issue of laziness. This in contrast, with the ant's great work ethic, something we will look at. But beyond just this one issue, notice in a broader sense what the author is ultimately saying to us in this, that an ant has a lot to teach us. In effect, that an ant can teach us about life. That's a curious thought. What can we learn from this most unlikely of teachers? What can we learn about life from observing an ant? Well, I believe that there's a lot of potential lessons here. But in closing out this series and picking up on some of the themes that we've seen throughout, I'd like to focus on, pick out four main thoughts, four main lessons in life from an ant. Lesson number one, it's your life, so live it. Notice the first thing that the writer says about ants. "Go to the ant, you lazy bones, consider its ways and be wise. Without having any chief or officer or ruler, it prepares its food in summer and gathers its sustenance in harvest." Without having any chief or officer or ruler. The first thing that the author of Proverbs notes about the ant is that it does its job, it gets about its business, its life, without anyone else in charge of it, without anyone overseeing it, without anyone having to drive it, to motivate it. It drives itself. That is, the first quality that the writer sees as admirable in the ant is that it is self-motivated. It takes responsibility for itself, for its own life. And this is where we begin, in the need to take responsibility for our own lives. That our lives are ultimately no one else's but our own. That so often our lives become mired in and ruined by the fact that we don't take responsibility for ourselves, for what is ours. That somehow, some way, we hand over responsibility for us to someone or something else. It happens all the time. We hand over our lives to fear, to habit, to excuses, to blame, to laziness. We hand over our lives to events of the past or to actions of other people. There's always some reason outside of us, somehow beyond us, as to why our lives aren't quite and can't quite be as they should or could be. I'd like to be a better person, to serve more, to help out more, to do more, to show up all the time, but, I just don't have the time. Not feeling well, and I'm not really good at that, The problem in my life, in my marriage, my family, my career, my church, my world is that other person over there, those events, right? Not me. I could be happy if only it weren't for this that happened, or that may happen, or this other person who always gets in my way, Someone once said, in life there are no real excuses, only varying degrees of rationalization. And that's really what we're talking about here. This kind of life of constantly rationalizing, making reasons for everything wrong in our lives that are anything but us. The opening point of our text being that your life never really gets going until you take responsibility for it. Not for everything, but for your own life, for what that is. That whatever your life is or is not is finally, entirely, only up to you. And to accept the power, the God-given power of this fact. Quit handing off this power. In effect, the first question of this text being, how and where are you not taking responsibility for your own life, and how is that holding you back today? Building then upon this fundamental notion of an ant's internal self-motivation, the writer continues by exploring some of the ways that this plays itself out. He writes, Without any chief or officer or ruler, it prepares its food in summer, and it gathers its sustenance in harvest. How long will you lie there, O lazy bones? When will you rise from your sleep? A little sleep, a little slumber, a little folding of the hands to rest, and poverty will come upon you like a robber, and want like an armed warrior. Notice, the ant is admirable, secondly, because it doesn't put things off, this life that it wants, It's self-motivated, it's self-responsible. It gathers its food at harvest time. It doesn't make the mistake of waiting until later when there will be none. It's an example of the dangers of procrastination, A little sleep, a little slumber, and poverty will come upon you like a robber, and want like an armed warrior. In effect, the next question posed by this text, in struggling to take responsibility for your life, what are you putting off? The stuff that you ought to do, that you know about, that's drawing it. What are you putting off that's potentially going to kill you, or at the very least, steal life from you? Someone once said that the greatest labor-saving device ever invented is tomorrow, right? It's true, isn't it? We all procrastinate, each in our own way. Some just outright do nothing. Others, though, they're constantly busy, always running from things, but they're always running around doing things, but they're running from the things that they ought to actually do, right? What are you putting off today? Even better, what are you running from today? This is the second question that the author hopes that we'll ask and learn from observing the ant. And in considering this immediacy and diligence of the ant, taking charge of his life and hoping to learn from it, note two things. First, that an ant is entirely forward-focused. He gathers now for later. He works today for tomorrow. Unfortunately, unlike most church folk, he's not consumed with the past. He's looking only to the future, right? His whole life is about what he wants tomorrow to be. How about us? How much of our never getting anywhere, never getting the life we want, never getting ahead is because we're trying only in some way to constantly go back? How often does life elude us because we're too stuck in what was and not working on making what could be? From this, then note also further that an ant is also not known as being a deep thinker, right? The author does not say, consider the ant and the profundity of its intellect, right? No, the ant is not noted for deep thought, right? If anything, as far as we can tell, the average ant doesn't think anything, right? The point being not that deep thought is bad, that we shouldn't try to think things through, think profound thoughts. Of course we should. That's important. It's only that sometimes, perhaps more often than not, we overthink things, right? That there's a time to stop thinking and just do it. Just do what you know you're being called to, the life you want. That the ant accomplishes things in his life now, takes responsibility for himself, and gets the life he wants because he doesn't overthink his way out of doing anything. What life, the life that is ours to make, are we putting off and losing because we're constantly backward thinking and overthinking? There's an old fable by Aesop entitled The Little Bear Cub, and it goes like this. There once was a little bear cub who was confused about how to walk. What do I do first? He thought to himself. Do I start with my right foot or my left? Or both front feet and then back feet? Or do I move both feet on one side and then both feet on the other? He was so frustrated he couldn't move. He saw the other children outside playing and he wanted to go join with them, but he couldn't figure out how. He was so upset. Eventually he decided to get help from his mother. Mother, I'm so confused as to how to walk, he said. What do I do first? Do I start with my right foot or my left? Or both front feet and then my back feet? Or do I move both feet on one side and then both sides of the other? His mother replied, well, son, come over here and I'll show you how it's done. And the little cub got up and walked over to his mother. And as he stood at her side, his mother just stared at him. And stared, and stared, and stared. And finally, the little bear cub realized that he had just walked. And with that, his mother said to him, sometimes you need to quit thinking about things and just do them. Just decide where you want to be and go there. First lesson from an ant, it's your life, so live it. Second lesson, your life matters. Of course, an overarching theme in this text, as well as I'm sure something we've all observed in our own observation of ants throughout our lives, is that ants are incredibly hard workers, right? Yeah. It's the underlying premise of the whole text, that ants work, that ants are hard workers, constant workers, their lives are devoted to work, right? The lesson in this being not that we ought to become some sort of frantic, workaholics or something, but rather only that we keep in mind the nature of the work that ants do, namely, their work is productive That is, ants are always doing something useful, something needed. And notice something particular about this. An ant doesn't just work for itself, it works for others. Most ants live in colonies, and within the colony, each ant has its job to do. Now, that job individually seems like absolutely nothing. For most ants, it's just go out and gather a crumb or something, just a little speck of food. So for things to work, each ant is needed. But when each ant does its little speck of a job on behalf of others, all find life, including itself. The lesson being obvious, for us to do the same. To live to do productive work that serves not only ourselves but others, realizing that our task within the home may often seem like almost nothing, but to realize that when we just faithfully do it, life comes to everybody, Basically, that if you live to make a difference, to touch other lives with kindness, to be used by God to bless the world in some way, life's going to come rushing back to you. To strive to live lives of significance, lives that matter, that change something, that make a difference beyond us. It's an odd lesson, it may seem, to take from what appears to be one of the most insignificant players in God's good creation, but you see, that is exactly the point. It confronts how much of our lives we are throwing away in things that don't really matter, and challenges us to take up our true significance within God's creation and saving work. One author writes, "This is a story about a singing bird. This bird didn't sing in the open, away from buildings and people. It didn't fly from tree to tree. In fact, this bird had very little freedom. Its home was a cage, and not a very large cage at that. The cage hung on a nail outside a small cottage, and many people passed it every day. The cage was put out every morning and taken in at night. It wasn't a very attractive cage, just a cheap basketware one. But the remarkable thing was that all the people who passed it morning and evening looked up to see if it was there, and when they saw it, a smile came upon their faces. The reason for all this interest was that inside the cage was a singing bird, and it sang continuously as if that was its sole purpose in life. As the businessman passed it each morning on the way to his office, he would look up and smile, and he carried that smile with him and pass it on to all that he met with during the day. The factory workers on their way to work would whistle or sing as they passed and continued with their tune to the factory floor. Children on their way to school stopped briefly to hear the bird's song, and it encouraged them and delighted them. Strangely, not one person said anything about the cheap cage. And that's the point. The most important thing was not the cottage or the basketware cage or even the bird, but the beautiful and infectious song it sang. The joyful notes, the sheer pleasure that it gave others, reached out far beyond its cheap cage to the offices and shops and factories and schools. So what can we learn from this little story of a singing bird in a cheap cage, hanging on a nail outside a small, unassuming cottage on the outskirts of town? Well, that it doesn't matter where we live, in the town or suburbs, or the country, in humble cottages or fine houses. Like the bird whose surroundings were unimpressive, what is important is what we are and what we do, that we make a difference. Jesus grew up in a modest home in the small town of Nazareth, a simple carpenter, yet he was the light of the world. What mattered to Jesus is what should matter to us, our spirit, our song of life, our conduct, and our love, to touch other lives for the better, to make a difference, and to matter. May we live for the highest, the noblest, and the best. You have so much to give. Second lesson to learn from an ant, your life matters. Which leads us into lesson number 3. Life comes with directions. Turning back for a moment to where we began our discussion today, with the issue of lessons all around us, somebody once said that the problem with life is that it doesn't come with an owner's manual. Right? And do you ever feel that way? Ever feel like you could really use some direction and guidance in your life, particularly when you're facing big obstacles or tough decisions? Well, beyond the specifics of the insect that our text this morning focuses on, notice the general idea that drives the whole text. As noted, that all around us, often in some of the most common, everyday places and things, insects going about their business, there are lessons. And in this, really messages from God helping us to live, guiding us and directing us, and that the wise person expects this and they look for it. As it says in the book of Psalms, the heavens are telling the glory of God, and the firmament proclaims his handiwork. Day to day pours forth speech, and night to night declares knowledge. In other words, God is continually talking to us. The problem is not that God doesn't communicate with us, but that we fail to listen. Right? Messages from God, love messages, really all the time, seeking to help us live. In a word of scripture, in a moment of worship, in the comment from a friend or from a stranger, in art, music in a display of concern, in a scene from a movie or a television program or an event in nature. And how do you know when just such a message, some moment that seems to touch your heart and help you, is actually from God? Well, it's very simple. When it affirms and encourages and inspires your life. Yeah, sometimes God has to challenge and confront us to get us on with life, but he never does that in a way that crushes us, but rather that is always immersed in grace. Jesus once said, "You who are parents, if one of your children asked for bread, would you give them a stone? Or if they asked for fish, would you give them a snake? Of course not. If you who are so deeply flawed seek only to give good things to your children, how much more good will your Father in heaven, who is perfect, give to you?" Messages from a loving Heavenly Father are all around us, seeking to help us on to life, Expect them, look for them, listen for them. Let me offer a personal example. Last fall, when everything was going really horribly wrong for my family, my wife Tracy was in the hospital on life support, heart surgery, massive stroke, and my diagnosis was of leukemia and the chemo wasn't working. Well, one morning I went to take out the garbage, and when I came back into the house through the garage, I recalled that there was some maintenance I needed to do on one of the old cars, so I grabbed my work clothes and I went to get changed. When I started getting changed, I took off my shirt and I laid it over the back of a chair, and as I did so, suddenly I noticed on the back of the shirt this huge locust, the big bud with the big long wings, great big locust, Needless to say, this kind of startled me, right, And I wasn't sure how long this thing had been there. My guess was that it must have landed on me when I went outside to take out the garbage. But whatever, I quickly wrapped a shirt around it, finished getting changed, and headed out with the wrapped up bug. As I wasn't sure if it was alive, I wasn't sure about this, but sure enough, when I flicked it open, the locust landed for a moment, then hit its wings and took off with its little racket, Now, with everything that was going wrong in my life at that particular moment, and with my usual sarcastic sense of humor, my first thought was, "What now, Lord? A plague of locusts? Really didn't break." But as I thought about it a little more, I realized it wasn't actually a plague of locusts. It was just one locust, right? And I had a little laugh as I told myself to not be so dramatic, But as I did so, suddenly it was as if I heard God speak to me in this moment saying, "Clark, that is exactly the point. What you're going through may seem like a plague of locusts, but trust me, it's going to be just one locust. I got a hold of things. And think of what just happened to you with that locust. It scared you. You dealt with it. And now you're laughing about it. The same will be true for you and Tracy. And so it is." Right? Think about that. A message from God brought to me by a bug. Right? Lesson number 3, life comes with directions. Listen for them. And then finally, lesson number 4, life is what happens while you're busy making other plans. In the end, returning to the specifics of our text today, consider the life of an ant. It has its work to do every day and its vital tasks within the life of the colony. But beyond setting its goal each day to go out and gather some food or some construction material for the community, an ant really doesn't have too much control over how its life goes, right? I'm sure that every morning when your average ant gets up and gets dressed for work, he's hoping that today that breadcrumb's going to be right outside his door, right? And sometimes it is, but a lot of times it isn't. An ant's life is at the whim of a lot of forces far beyond its control. But notice, it doesn't seem like most ants stress out about this. Right? Maybe they do. Maybe there's an epidemic of ant anxiety that we don't know about, right? But it doesn't seem that way. It seems like they just get on with their life no matter how it goes today. For the most part, they have to take life as it comes, and they do day by day, and life comes right back to them. And that, I believe, is the final lesson for us all here. That yes, we should each have goals and plans and objectives for our lives for each day that we live, but also to always remember that much of life is so far beyond our control, and that the wise person doesn't stress out about it, believing that either that if life doesn't go the way they want, that it's all ruined and hopeless, or that when it doesn't go right, they must force it back to the way they want, but rather to learn to accept and to embrace the detours. What's the old saying? Blessed are the flexible, for they don't get bent out of shape. Right? Yeah. Instead of living a life of constant frustration and disappointment to live a life instead of flexibility and adventure, seeking the greater things God has in store than what we had planned. As Oscar Wilde once rightly said, in this world there are only two real tragedies. One is not getting what you want, the other is getting it. Right? In closing, consider the following true story. I heard this a couple years ago at a clergy meeting when one of the pastors told the story of his daughter. It seems this pastor's daughter was a very beautiful, very talented girl, and throughout her life, her dream was always to become a model. And in her late teens, she was all set, ready to go off to Europe. She had a contract to do high-fashion modeling. But in her senior year of high school, one night she was coming home from a party with some friends in the car she was in, hit some ice, spun, and crashed. Everyone in the car was fine, except her. She was badly injured, and her face was severely disfigured. She spent the next couple of months in the hospital, undergoing multiple complicated reconstructive surgeries. She was incredibly, understandably, depressed and angry and hopeless. As far as she could see, all her dreams were over. About halfway through her stay in the hospital, however, a new roommate was moved into her room. And this was another young teenage girl, and this one was battling cancer. And the two struck up an immediate friendship. Eventually, it came time for the girl who had been in the accident to leave the hospital. But even once she left, she made a point to keep coming back to visit her friend. And having been in the hospital, for so long, she sort of knew the drill. And so whenever she would come by for a visit, she would help take care of her friend, getting things, changing bandages, and so forth. She became incredibly intrigued by the disease that plagued her friend, and she began reading everything she could find out about it. And gradually, she discovered that she had a really great interest in medicine, and it excited her like nothing else. Long story short, she eventually decided to become a nurse, which is exactly what she did. She went back to school, she got her degree, and today she is an RN, and she's happier than she's ever been. And on the weekend in which she completed her medical studies, a special celebration was held at her church, and all her friends and family were invited, most especially her friend from the hospital. And in her remarks to those assembled, she closed with the following prayer. She said, "Dear Lord, I thank you, because even though I didn't get what I wanted, you helped me to see all that I could have." Go to the ant, consider its ways, and be wise. It's amazing the places where one can learn things, where, in and what God seeks to teach us. Some lessons from a six-legged teacher to close out our study of the book of Proverbs. It's your life, so live it. Your life matters. Life comes with directions. And life is what happens when you're busy making other plans. Let us join together in singing our closing hymn, number 57 in the red hymnal, "O for 1,000 tongues to sing." Would you please stand?